Eastern Europe's winter is turning this war into a survival test, with logistics as the real front line. Russia feels it harder, as a rotating force must be fed, fueled, armed, and kept warm across long routes that freeze and slow. Field reports point to shortages of fuel, food, ammunition, and heating gear in some Russian units, and morale can crack before any trench line does. Ukraine exploits that gap with UAV surveillance and FPV strikes on rear convoys, and in ice conditions, one-hit vehicle can stall a whole column. Sanctions and winter costs bite, while Russia keeps cycling large numbers through Ukraine. Outside trackers using publicly available records have documented over 150,000 Russian deaths, while overall casualty estimates climb far beyond that. At home, budget gaps and weaker oil and gas revenue drive cuts and reserve drawdowns, and failing city heating feeds anger. Ukraine's I Want to Live channel offers an exit route for older or chronically ill soldiers. Stay with military force because cold, drones, and money are tightening into one chain that may decide what happens next. Winter in Eastern Europe is not just a weather problem because it rewrites the logistics math for both armies. When temperatures dive far below freezing, every movement burns more fuel, every stop takes longer, and every mistake costs more than it would in mild conditions. For Russia, the strain is sharper because a large rotating force needs a steady flow of supplies across long routes, and distance turns cold into a multiplier instead of a background detail. Snow and ice slow transport, and trucks that would run a full day on one tank now consume more just to keep engines alive and cabs warm. Winter punishes distance more than bullets. This is why winter turns routine deliveries into fragile operations, and it opens the door to failures that start small and end big. Cold also attacks electronics, and that is where modern armies feel the hit fast. Batteries drain quicker, radios lose range, and simple tasks like charging devices start to depend on generators that need steady resupply. Even when parts work, they work worse, because sensors fog, cables stiffen, and crews spend minutes solving failures while the clock keeps moving. Once communications slip, command rhythm slips too, and a late delivery is not just late, it can break coordination between units that depend on timing. In winter, the gap between delayed and unsafe gets thin, so the next problem is not firepower, it is control. The biggest winter cost is hidden because maintenance becomes constant and spare parts become a lifeline. Metal contracts and expands, seals crack, lubricants thicken, and engines that were reliable in autumn start to fail in patterns that crews cannot fully predict. A convoy that loses vehicles to breakdown does not just lose cargo, it loses pace. And pace is protection when drones are watching. Heating gear also matters, since a soldier who cannot stay warm sleeps worse and loses judgment, and that weakness spreads through a platoon. When cold stress stacks with hunger and fatigue, discipline becomes harder to hold, and a defensive position becomes more about endurance than tactics. So winter is not only damaging machines, it is grinding down the people inside them. The strategic twist is that the cold front is hitting while long-range strikes keep targeting energy systems, which raises demand for power and heat at the worst time. If the rear has to fight to keep lights on and boilers running, then the same state has to also fund food, ammunition, and winter kit for troops in the field. A large force is expensive in any season, yet in deep winter it becomes a moving city that must be fed and warmed every day, or it starts to freeze in place. When budgets tighten and supply chains stretch, hard choices appear, and those choices do not stay at the front. When the supply chain stretches across many kilometers, an interruption can ripple outward, and one delay can create another, until a single bad day becomes a week of lost tempo. That is why winter does not need to defeat an army directly, because it can slow it and slow it again, until the whole system starts to sag. And once logistics is strained, the first capability that fades is usually offensive action, because attacks require surplus, while defense can survive on less for a short time. That is the hinge of the story, because when the basics start to fail, shortages stop being rumors and become battlefield outcomes. Shortages at the front do not just weaken firepower, because they attack the basic belief that the system behind the unit still works. When fuel runs low, a tank does not only stop moving, it loses its place in the whole plan, because engines cannot idle for heat and vehicles cannot shift positions on time. The same fuel also feeds field kitchens, generators, and small heaters, so a dry tank can shut down warmth, charging, and cooking in one chain reaction. That is when combat turns into survival management, and soldiers start counting hours of heat instead of meters of ground. Once that shift happens, every order sounds harder to obey because the body is already fighting the cold first. And when the body starts to lose, the mind follows. Food shortages make that mental slide faster because hunger changes how people think and how they treat each other. A unit that eats less sleeps worse, and a unit that sleeps worse makes more mistakes, even if it still has enough rifles and radios. Discipline weakens when soldiers argue over rations, and small conflicts can grow into open resentment toward officers who cannot fix the problem. In that climate, ideology loses weight, while the instinct to stay alive becomes the main rule, and that is the moment morale begins to crack from the inside. The front line does not need a direct assault to feel this pressure, because the pressure is already sitting in the stomach and the bones. That is why logistics is also psychological warfare. Ammunition gaps then force tactical changes that look smart on paper, but often signal weakness in real time. If shells and small arms rounds are limited, commanders avoid long firefights and try to save supplies for emergencies, which can reduce flexibility. Units pull back into buildings, basements, and dugouts to lower exposure, yet that clustering can create predictable patterns that surveillance can read. In winter, staying tight also increases heat signatures around shelters, so hiding becomes harder even while movement becomes riskier. This is the cruel trade, because conserving ammo can also mean giving the enemy clearer targets to track and shape. And once a unit feels watched, it behaves like it is trapped. These frontline stories often spread through rumors and phone calls, and not every detail can be treated as confirmed fact without strong open-source proof. Some claims about extreme ration collapse or primitive transport may be real in certain sectors, but they still need verification before being used as hard numbers. Even so, the pattern is consistent across modern wars, because when supply is uncertain, troops start to plan around scarcity, and that alone changes behavior. A soldier does not need an official report to feel that the chain is slipping, because the chain is judged by warm food, working batteries, and full magazines. Once doubt becomes normal, fear becomes a habit. And habit is what the battlefield runs on. In modern warfare, morale often breaks before defenses fall, because the mind gives up when it no longer expects support to arrive on time. That collapse can look quiet, with slower reactions, weaker initiative, and more surrender talk long before any formal retreat is ordered. It also creates openings for the other side, because a pressured unit becomes easier to fix in place, easier to predict, and easier to isolate. When soldiers believe the rear cannot feed them, they stop thinking in terms of mission and start thinking in terms of exit. That is the turning point, because once logistics becomes a fear, drones can turn that fear into paralysis from above. Ukraine's drone war is not just about blowing things up, because it is about breaking the enemy's logistics rhythm behind the front line. UAVs watch the routes like a security camera that never sleeps, and once a convoy is spotted, FPV teams do not need to destroy every truck to win the moment. They only need the right target, because a fuel tanker, an ammo carrier, or a recovery vehicle can be the keystone that holds the whole movement together. One hit can turn a moving column into a traffic jam, and a traffic jam becomes a waiting room for the next strike. That is how a small drone can create a big effect, even without a large warhead. And the cold makes that effect stronger. In freezing conditions, a disabled vehicle is not only a loss, it becomes a hard obstacle that is difficult to move. Tow cables stiffen, engines struggle, and crews exposed outside the cab lose heat fast, so recovery takes longer and demands more support vehicles. The longer a convoy sits still, the longer it stays visible, and drones can reattack with better angles because the target is no longer changing speed or direction. This is why winter turns a temporary stop into a dangerous trap, since time is the one resource a convoy cannot replace. And when time is lost, options shrink. Recon UAVs also shape timing, because the best strike is often the one that forces the worst bottleneck. Operators can wait until trucks pile up at a narrow bridge approach, a sharp turn, a forest edge, or a road junction where vehicles must slow down and bunch together. In that moment, the convoy cannot scatter fast, and drivers cannot simply turn off the road without risking getting stuck in snow or mud under ice. A single impact then creates a chain reaction because the vehicles behind cannot pass, the vehicles ahead cannot reverse easily, and the whole formation becomes predictable. Predictability is what makes precision cheap, and cheap precision is what makes logistics feel unsafe every day. So the strike is not only physical, it is behavioral. Recent large-scale drone activity also hints at a two-layer method, where quantity creates confusion and precision creates permanent damage. A wave of drones can force air defenses to fire, maneuver, and reveal positions, while a smaller set of FPVs hunts the high-value logistics targets that matter most. Even if many drones are intercepted, the cost and attention still land on the defender, and the attacker only needs a few to leak through at the right time. That creates a fatigue problem, because air defense crews cannot stay perfect forever, and convoy protection cannot be everywhere at once. So the rear area becomes a pressure zone instead of a safe zone. The operational consequence is brutal in winter, because a battalion without fuel is not a fighting force. It is frozen metal that cannot reposition, cannot evacuate wounded, and cannot sustain tempo. When spare parts are limited and repairs take longer in the cold, replacement cycles slow down, and the budget cost rises because each damaged truck triggers extra transport, extra security, and extra maintenance. This is how a drone campaign can raise the daily price of war without even touching the main trenches, since the real drain happens on the roads. And if convoys keep getting cut into pieces this way, the bigger question becomes whether Russia can keep feeding and rotating a very large force in Ukraine under winter pressure and economic limits. Keeping a very large rotating force in Ukraine is not only a battlefield choice, because it becomes a daily logistics and money problem that never stops. The bigger the force, the bigger the daily bill, and that bill is not just shells and diesel. It is medevac, winter kit, transport, repairs, food, batteries, heaters, and the constant need to move people in and out before units burn out. In deep cold, even basic routines get expensive because vehicles need extra care, engines cannot be left cold, and storage of fuel and ammo becomes harder to protect and move. So the mass that looks powerful on a map can turn into a heavy load in real life, especially when routes are long and fragile. That is where winter and sanctions start to squeeze at the same time. A long supply line in winter means every delay costs more than time, because it forces backup convoys, extra security, and emergency fixes that drain stocks fast. If a route breaks for one day, the missing deliveries do not vanish, they stack up, and the system must catch up while under attack from drones and under pressure from weather. This turns war planning into ration planning, because commanders must think about what can be sustained, not only what can be captured. When the war becomes feed the force first, offensive action becomes harder to keep steady. And when tempo drops, the force still needs the same calories and heat. Losses make this cycle harsher, because replacements must fill gaps while the machine keeps moving. Independent name-by-name tallies built from public records have put confirmed Russian deaths above 150,000, and some recent updates push that verified list past 163,600 identified fatalities. That is not a guess. It is a minimum based on known names, and it shows the scale of the drain even before broader estimates are discussed. At the same time, there are much higher casualty claims from warring sides and some outside assessments, yet those figures are estimates, not confirmed identities, so they have to be treated as ranges rather than fixed totals. This distinction matters because a verified list speaks to what is proven, while estimates speak to what is likely, and mixing the two creates confusion. Still, both point in the same direction, which is sustained attrition on a massive scale. And sustained attrition forces policy choices. When casualties stay high and rotations continue, recruitment pressure grows, and that pressure usually leads to lower standards or wider nets. It can mean pulling in older men, accepting poorer health, shortening training, or offering bigger bonuses that strain budgets even more. Quality then becomes a risk, because less training and weaker fitness reduce combat performance, and weaker performance can cause more losses, which feeds the same loop again. This is how an army can get trapped in a consumption cycle, where every month demands more people and more money just to stay in place. It is not only a military issue, because society starts to feel it through recruitment, funerals, and economic trade-offs. And once the war machine needs constant refill, the real test moves to the rear, because the rear has to finance, equip, and justify it through winter. That is why the next question is not only what happens on the road to the front, but what happens to the state that is paying for that road every single day. Russia's war effort is now being squeezed from behind the front line because fiscal stress is rising while energy income is no longer a reliable shock absorber. Official figures and press calculations point to a 2025 budget deficit near 5.6 trillion rubles, roughly $72 billion, which signals that wartime outlays are climbing faster than steady revenue can follow. That gap matters because it forces hard choices, as ministries can delay projects, regions can see tighter transfers, and the state can pull more money from reserve pools that were built for stability, not for a long campaign. To cover shortfalls, the government can lean on domestic borrowing and one-off measures. Yet those moves can lift debt service costs and push more economic pain into the future. When a government starts funding a conflict by draining cushions, people do not read it as strategy, they read it as risk. And that feeling travels from balance sheets into everyday life. The same strain shows up in the oil and gas line because hydrocarbons are still the main lever for Moscow. Yet that lever moves with prices, exchange rates, and export constraints. Reuters estimates for November 2025 suggested oil and gas revenue could be down about 35% year-on-year. And that drop is not just a statistic, it is a warning light for the war chest. Even if volumes find workarounds, discounts to buyers, shipping costs, and changing tax intake can cut what finally reaches the budget, which means the state's room to spend can shrink without any dramatic headline. In that environment, social spending becomes the quiet battlefield, because freezing or trimming benefits hits households directly, and households notice fast when inflation and utility bills already feel heavy. Tighter budgets can also mean fewer repairs, slower procurement for cities, and more strain on local governments that already operate close to the edge. Once money gets tight at the center, the rear begins to look like the front, and that link is where legitimacy starts to erode. Winter makes the connection sharper because old infrastructure does not forgive stress, and heating failures turn politics into something that can be measured in degrees. Reports of urban heating accidents and worn systems breaking down create a simple story for citizens, since a cold apartment feels like neglect, not like geopolitics. When services fail at the same time that recruitment posters and casualty notices keep arriving, frustration spreads through families, workplaces, and local officials who have to answer for problems they did not create. The result is a public mood that is harder to manage because loyalty becomes conditional, and the cost of the war is felt as discomfort, delay, and uncertainty. That backdrop sets the stage for a different kind of exit route for soldiers, one built around organized surrender rather than blind endurance. Ukraine's I Want to Live project has positioned itself as a channel for Russian troops, especially older men or those with chronic health issues, to signal intent to give up and seek safer handling. The point is not romance or propaganda, it is logistics, because a clear path to surrender can reduce chaos, lower the chance of a panic firefight, and offer a way out for people who no longer believe the bargain they were sold. And when surrender becomes thinkable, commanders must spend time on control, not only combat. As the rear strains and the front hardens, the question becomes whether morale breaks slowly or suddenly, and which triggers will decide the next turn. Winter is exposing a brutal rule, because wars are not decided by firepower alone. They are decided by whether a system can stay alive every day. When drones slice logistics into small, constant losses, a big force can stop being an advantage and start becoming a heavy load that must be fed in the ice. That is why the key story is not only shells and tanks, it is the fragile chain that keeps units moving, heated, supplied, and calm. And that chain is under pressure, as confirmed death notices keep adding names while overall casualty totals remain disputed. The bigger danger is the speed at which society stops trusting the promise of victory. And Mediazona's open-source tracking shows how that pressure becomes personal. That slow loss of belief is the real winter weapon, and it keeps pushing the conflict into the rear. One path is deeper wartime tightening, where Moscow forces the economy to carry the front. Yet Reuters reporting suggests the political cost rises when heating networks fail and public services stumble again. Another path is a tactical slowdown, where Russia spends less to preserve manpower and stockpiles. But that choice also means accepting a lower tempo and fewer gains on the map. A third path is more organized surrender among vulnerable soldiers, and Ukraine's "I Want to Live" channel shows how a controlled exit can spread when conditions feel hopeless. If that trend grows, it may hint at a deeper manpower problem if the war runs through more winters, and that is the signal to watch. If this kind of clear battlefield analysis matters, subscribe to Military Force and stay close for what the next winter phase may reveal.